What is unfolding in Ukraine? Bill Wiley has investigated war crimes for 25 years in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe with various public bodies, including Canada's Department of Justice and the International Criminal Court. He is now the Executive Director of the Commission for International Justice and Accountability. Mr. Wiley, Western leaders are calling the alleged atrocities in Bucha a war crime. When you look at the images and the reports coming out of the region, what do you see?
Well, I couldn't agree more. It's clearly a war crime, and indeed, its breadth and depth suggests that there's crimes against humanity as well.
President Volodymyr Zelensky has gone further and called it genocide. What do you make of that?
Well, genocide is a special intent crime, and it requires an intent to destroy an entire group. And groups defined in different ways, but it doesn't extend to a political opponent. So legally speaking, there's no evidence of genocide at this point, and I wouldn't expect to see that in the future.
Help for people who are not familiar with this part of international law, help us understand the distinction between war crimes versus crimes against humanity and how it applies here.
Yeah, crimes against humanity are effectively war crimes that are perpetrated on a widespread or systematic basis. So if there's the murder of one or two people by, for example, retreating Russian troops, this would be a war crime. But when, in terms of space and time, the war crimes become more and more spread out, then it rises to the level of crimes against humanity. That's the fundamental distinction.
There are many calls for justice today. We hear U.S. President Joe Biden talking about Vladimir Putin being put on trial. Help us understand what the process of seeking accountability and justice looks like going ahead.
Well, first and foremost, it's important for your viewers to understand that it's not Russia or solely Vladimir Putin who is going to be put on trial. It's a question of establishing individual criminal responsibility of commanders, whether they be military commanders, security intelligence officers, or indeed political leaders such as Mr. Putin and those around him. So the first obvious key starting point is to establish that offenses have been perpetrated, which certainly seems to be the case in the Ukraine since February, since the start of this war. And then secondly, we need to link those offenses to high-ranking officers, political, military, security intelligence personnel. And this takes some time. A lot of attention to detail is required there.
Talk to me a little bit about the time frame for all of this. I mean, how long, for instance, would we expect investigations like this to take and then to the point of actually holding people to account?
Well, if one's dealing with low-level perpetrators and the evidence is sufficient, a case can be put together in relatively short order. So if we take the incident or incidences at Bucha and surrounding area that came to light over the weekend, if we're looking at, say, battalion commander, brigade commander, something like that, the case could be put together fairly quickly on the basis of captured Russian materials and eyewitnesses, Ukrainian eyewitnesses at the scene, if you will. And also a key would be prisoners captured from the perpetrating units. And the Ukrainians will very much be on the lookout for those kinds of individuals. So a case like that can be done quite quickly. If ultimately one wants to build a case against Mr. Putin or his Minister of Defense, the Chief of the Army Staff in Moscow, this would take quite some time. I would say certainly a year, perhaps longer, and ultimately it will depend on how much of what we call crime base is included. So is one looking at a relatively small number of incidents, or let's say over the entire course of the war to at least this point? So again, broadly speaking, a year or two. And that's separate from the issue of arrestability.
So when you hear things like U.S. President Joe Biden saying he should be tried for war crimes, do you think that there is a scenario where that happens? I know you're talking about like the feasibility, how it could happen, but do you think that it's likely to happen, I suppose?
Oh, I think there'll be war crimes trials. There's a number of different jurisdictions, not least Ukraine, where that can take place, or additionally, the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over the situation in Ukraine. Having said that, the fundamental problem is arrestability. So seeing Mr. Putin brought, for example, to The Hague or before a properly constituted court anywhere, I wouldn't anticipate that for a range of political diplomatic reasons. But lower level perpetrators, I think there's a reasonable prospect of seeing trials in fairly short order, simply because the Ukrainians hold so many prisoners and indeed officers. Now, this isn't to suggest that they're all war criminals or even that the majority of them are. But if I were the Ukrainians, I'd be having a very, very careful trawl through the ranks of certainly the officer prisoners looking for possible suspects in that component.
I wonder, with your background and the things that I can only imagine that you have seen and are familiar with in terms of what human beings can do to each other, what it is like for you to see these pictures coming out of Bucha, to hear that this is only the tip of the iceberg from Ukrainian officials. So, you know, how do you process what we're all seeing with the experience that you have?
Well, first I'd say after 25 years as a war crimes investigator, I'm not surprised. Indeed, I wrote a briefing paper at the beginning of March for the Americans and colleagues in the British government, setting out that where I thought we'd see the most serious criminality would be in territory that had been occupied or was being occupied by the Russians. So in that respect, there's no surprise. And the murder of civilians, well, I've seen that every day, so to speak, for 25 years. But it is particularly shocking, I have to confess, to see that in Europe. Not because I would suggest that Europeans are inherently more civilized or indeed less. It's just that we don't see war in Europe. We haven't seen war in Europe of this magnitude, well, since the Second World War, and a serious war in Europe, frankly, since the war in the former Yugoslavia from 91 to 95.
Is there any part of you that thinks that this could or should somehow have been prevented, or do you just see this, like, I don't want to sound too philosophical here because this is so brutal and so real, but that this is just part of the human condition?
Well, the only way to have prevented the crimes, I would suggest in this context, is to have prevented the war, because there's fundamental flaws with Russian doctrine and Russian military culture. And I hasten to add, not with Russian culture per se, or with Russians per se, but the problem is, if you will, baked into Russian military doctrine. And so once the war started, I would suggest that this kind of criminality was inevitable.
It's a difficult thing to hear in light of the pictures we're seeing right now. But Bill Wiley, thank you for providing some insight into where things could go from here. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.